It is an extraordinary honor to receive the Harold Washington Award. Some of you may know that I originally moved to Chicago in part because of the inspiration of Mayor Washington's campaign. And he was there in Chicago when I moved there more than 2 decades ago. And for those of you who recall that era and recall Chicago at that time, it's hard to forget the sense of possibility that he sparked in people. I'll never forget how he reached out to everyone, black, brown, and white, to build a coalition for change. He wasn't part of the insider crowd. He wasn't somebody who the establishment immediately embraced. But he understood that ultimately power comes from people. And that if you are working at a grassroots and people trust that you are fighting for them, then there's nothing you can't accomplish. And I'll never forget how in those painful days after his ultimate death, I saw a sign with his picture on it that had the words, "His spirit lives on." And as I look out at all of you tonight, I know that on this night, in this room, the spirit of Harold Washington lives on. Now, this year's conference falls at a particularly momentous time for America. Our nation is waging 2 wars. We're in the midst of a financial crisis as profound as any that we've faced since the Great Depression. But we know that the storm we've seen on Wall Street in recent days and weeks didn't start there. It grew out of the quiet storms that have been bearing down on families across this country for years. The storms of people who are tricked by predatory mortgages. The storms that take place when a mother loses her job or a family loses their home, or where parents lie awake at night wondering how they're going to save enough for their child's college education or their own retirement. Those quiet storms are hitting all our families. And we know they've struck with the most fury on those who can least afford it. Americans of every creed and color have lost their jobs in recent months, 600,000 so far since January. And we also know that in the last year, African Americans have lost their jobs at a faster rate than at any time in a quarter century. That's a wrong that needs to be made right. Our housing crisis is devastating neighborhoods in all our cities and all our towns. And we know that black and brown families are twice as likely to face foreclosure from subprime loans. That's a wrong we need to make right. Working men and women of every race and region are seeing their incomes drop. And we know that it's been tougher on folks in many of our neighborhoods. They were already behind. They were already sick. They were already tired. Those are wrongs that need to be made right, not just because our economy demands it, not just because our conscience demands it, because that's how we'll keep our founding promise of equality for all people. Dr. King once said, "Economic justice is the inseparable twin of racial justice," because it makes little difference if you can sit at the lunch counter if you can't afford the lunch. It makes little difference if you can sit at the front of the bus if you can't afford the bus fare. It makes little difference if a neighborhood integrates if you can't afford a home there, if you can't send your child to school there. What Dr. King understood is that so long as economic justice is denied, his dream would be deferred. So when nearly half of all black children from middle-class families end up near poor, when the middle class that so many of you helped build is at risk, it's not just a threat to those children or those families, it's a threat to the America we all believe in, an America where you can make of your life what you will. where the only barrier to success is how hard you're willing to work, how big those dreams are that you're willing to dream. That's the America that is at stake in this election. And that's why I'm running for President of the United States. Now, as you probably saw, last night we had a debate. And on issue after issue, from taxes to health care to the war in Iraq, you heard John McCain make the case for more of the same. The same policies that got us into this mess. A continuation of the disastrous war in Iraq. A continuation of tax cuts for those who don't need them and weren't even asking for them. But just as important as what we heard from John McCain was what we didn't hear. We talked about the economy for 40 minutes, and not once did Senator McCain bother to talk about the struggles of middle-class families, of working-class families, what they are facing each and every day. He defended his plan to give $300 billion in tax cuts to the big, wealthy corporations, but he had nothing to say about the fact that wages have flatlined and jobs are being shipped overseas. He railed against some study of bears in Montana. He's really hung up on those bears, but he had nothing to say about the fact that more and more Americans can't afford to pay for college, can't afford health care for their families, and can't afford a retirement that is dignified and secure. Again and again, Senator McCain spoke about the need to keep spending $10 billion a month in Iraq. Said nothing about the need to end this war so we could spend $10 billion rebuilding cities all across America, rebuilding our roads and our bridges, training young men and young women so that they can get off the streets and actually make something of themselves right here in the United States. The truth is, through 90 minutes of debating, John McCain had a lot to say about me, but he had nothing to say about you. He had nothing to say about the struggles Americans are facing today. He didn't even mention the word middle class. He didn't talk about working families, not once. Senator McCain doesn't get it. Well, CBC, I do get it. And you get it. And I think the American people get it. I think they understand we can't afford another 4 more years of misguided policies. We know many Americans are outraged about the economic crisis we're in. I'm outraged too. It was reckless for speculators on Wall Street to game the system, irresponsible for regulators in Washington to look the other way. But now we're here, every American, all of us, have a stake in making sure that this crisis doesn't consume the entire economy. We all have a stake in making sure the financial system is saved from collapse because our families' jobs, life savings, economic security are all at risk. It is unacceptable, though, to expect the American people to hand this administration, or even any administration, a $700 billion blank check with no conditions and no oversight, when lack of oversight in Washington and Wall Street is what got us into this mess in the first place. So negotiations have been proceeding. I've been on the phone all day. I've laid out some core conditions that any agreement must meet. And I'm proud of the fact that the CBC and the Democratic caucus have been championing many of these same provisions. We have to have oversight and accountability for how and where this money is spent every step of the way. We must make sure that every penny American taxpayers spend to finance this solution is a penny that the American people can get back because this program's been properly structured to treat them as investors. We cannot and will not simply bail out Wall Street without helping millions of innocent homeowners who are struggling to stay in their homes in our communities all across America. And finally, and this is important, the American people must not be rewarding the very same Wall Street CEOs whose greed and irresponsibility got us into this mess in the first place. That is not acceptable. But understand, while these principles will help us solve our current crisis, we also have to solve our long-term crisis. We have to deal with those quiet storms out there by changing the economic policies and priorities in Washington. I mean, how many members of the CBC have heard, well, we can't afford to do anything about the incarceration rates in your communities and dealing with expenditures. It's just too expensive. We can't think about rebuilding our cities. Not possible. Rural communities don't have broadband internet. Well, that might cost $1 billion. Can't do it. And yet, when we really want to do something, it seems like we can do it. So now's the time for us to make a decision that we want to make life better for working Americans, those who are going and getting a paycheck because they're working as teachers and nurses and bus drivers and postal workers, the same folks who are the backbone of our community. Understand, what we've seen in recent days and weeks is nothing less than a final verdict on a failed philosophy. A philosophy that says if we give more and more to those with the most, prosperity will trickle down on everyone else. That says no harm will be done if we let lobbyists shred consumer protections and fight every regulation that's out there. You wouldn't know it from listening to my opponent last night, but he's embraced this philosophy for 26 years. George W. Bush embraced this philosophy. And that's the philosophy that I will change when I am President of the United States of America. So, let me wrap up by saying this. Let me tell you what change means. Change isn't grabbing one of my signs or cribbing some of my lines. Change isn't just a slogan saying I'm for change too. I'm a maverick. That's not change. Change means, y'all notice, right? He's taking my stuff. That's not what change means. Change is what's in your heart. Change is what's in your gut. Change is who are you going to fight for when you get into that Oval Office. Change means a tax code that doesn't reward the lobbyists who wrote it, but the American workers and small businesses who deserve it. That's why I'm going to stop giving tax breaks to corporations that ship jobs overseas. Let's give them to somebody who's investing in communities right here in the United States of America, in Flint, Michigan, or in Dayton, Ohio, or Decatur, Illinois. Somebody from Decatur back there. I will cut taxes for 95% of all working families. My opponent doesn't want you to know this. My plan will actually lower rates below what they were under Ronald Reagan. If you make less than $250,000 a year, you will not see your tax increase, one single dime. Because in an economy like this, we don't want to take money out of the pockets of the middle class. I'll finally keep the promise of affordable, accessible health care for every single American. Members of the CBC, like John Conyers, have been fighting a long time. It is time we realized the promise of making sure that everybody has accessible health care. If you've got health care, we're going to lower your premiums. If you don't, you'll be able to get the same kind of coverage that we members of Congress give ourselves. John McCain's up there talking about socialized medicine. I notice where he's getting his health care from. The United States government. Seems to me, if it's good enough for him, we'll help make sure that the quality health care that you get doesn't depend on the color of your skin or where you live. We will close health care disparities in this country for adults and children alike. In an Obama administration, we'll finally meet our moral obligation to provide every child with a world-class education. because it's an outrage that in the 21st century, our kids are still going to overcrowded classes in underfunded schools taught by teachers who aren't getting the support they need. So we're going to fix our crumbling schools and recruit an army of new teachers to our community, pay them more money, give them more support. We'll hold them to high standards, but we won't have them teaching to a test. And we were going to keep the promise to every young American: if you are committed to serving your community or your country, then you will be able to afford a college education. That is a commitment that we are going to make, because the fight for economic justice begins in the classroom. But it doesn't end there. We're going to have to break the cycle of poverty and violence gripping so many neighborhoods in this country. We're going to expand the Earned Income Tax Credit. If you work, you shouldn't be poor. We'll end the Bush policy of taking cops off the street at the moments they're needed most, so we can give law enforcement the support they need to keep our communities safe. And we'll make sure that our laws are applied equally to everybody. We're going to make sure that we provide job training for ex-offenders, so we can make sure they don't return to a life of crime. That's being smart on crime. And we are going to launch an all-hands-on-deck effort to end poverty in this country, so we can put the dream for which so many gave so much within the reach of all of our children. So yes, we've got to lift up our struggling families. We have to solve this economic crisis. We have to look out for the middle class, not just now, but for the future, because that's how this economy works. That's how this economy grows. I know this economic crisis may be affecting my budget as president, but I reject the idea that you can't build a strong middle class at a time when our economy is weak. Just the opposite. A strong middle class is the cornerstone of a strong economy. Making sure that working people have rising incomes is the basis for economic growth. There's no contradiction between growth and equality, just the opposite. What we've seen over the last 8 years is growing inequality that impedes and hampers our growth. Building a middle class will be a cornerstone of my presidency all across America and in every community, in the black community, in the Hispanic community, in white communities, everywhere. I want small businesses to grow. I want people to be able to find a job that pays a living wage. I want to make sure they're not bankrupt when they get sick. I want them to be able to retire with dignity and respect. That unites all of America, and that's going to be the cornerstone of our administration. Now, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen overnight. I see people in the audience here who are fighting the good fight right now. See Deval Patrick over there. Outstanding governor. Karen Bass, speaker in California. My fellow CBC members, my man, Emil Jones from Illinois. You've been fighting the good fight for a long time, and we know it doesn't come easy. You know that we have to overcome our doubts, our divisions, our cynicism. We have to overcome a determined opposition of powerful special interests before we can truly reform our broken economy and advance opportunity. But who knows better than the CBC what it's like to persevere? Who knows better what it's like to overcome great odds? At the time of the CBC founding nearly 40 years ago, riots were shaking our cities. Communities had turned on each other. People were shut out of the American promise. Strife and conflict flared everywhere. And the United States Congress was home to just over a dozen black members. We know that progress can be made. We know because our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, they fought in much more difficult circumstances than we fought. We know what it's like to stand on their shoulders and understand that, well, maybe I'm not going to get here, but maybe my child will get there. I may not be able to go to college, but my child will go to college. I may not be able to buy a decent house, but my child will buy a decent house. I may not be able to get elected to Congress, but my child can aspire to go to Congress. I may not ever see a black man be able to be in the White House, but maybe my child will see it or my grandchild will see it. That's a long way that we've come. And I know that if you're willing to show that same kind of dedication that people like Shirley Chisholm and John Conyers showed in founding the CBC, if you're willing to put your shoulder to the wheel of history, if you're willing to march with me and get people registered to vote and stand with me in November, then 40 years from now, our children will look back and say that like those who came before, we did not shrink from the challenges we faced. Like those who came before, we held fast to our ideals of opportunity and justice and equality. Like those who came before us, we remembered the words of the Scripture and cast off everything that hindered our way and ran with perseverance the race that was set before us. That is our mission. That is our goal. Thank you very much, CBC. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.